Hi, I'm Ryan. I designed and built a Red Bull Air Race inspired plane. I'm making this video because I want to show you what I ended up with, but I also want to give an overview of some of the steps I took to get from idea to flying model, and also to explain some of the build techniques I used and the general assembly of the aircraft. Before I begin, I have to let you know that most of this was new to me, so I was learning along the way throughout 90% of this process, probably. I have about 3 years of experience of building foam board aircraft and flying them, but I'm a beginner when it comes to designing a plane from scratch and making a set of build plans that are intuitive or at the very least usable. So bear with me throughout this because I know I made a lot of mistakes and I'm always looking for ways to improve, but I still want to share with you what I did. Maybe you could learn from all the mistakes I made, because I made plenty of them. What's important is that you do what works best for you. You don't have to do what everyone tells you to do. Make mistakes in a controlled environment, learn from those mistakes, and always be open to feedback. So let's get into this. I broke this down into 4 major parts: design, build, test, and improve. The last step, improve, can be done throughout the entire process, and I actually encourage you to do it throughout the process. As you'll see, I was constantly making improvements. It just makes more sense to make a change as you see it instead of waiting till the end. I just had to put it at the end there because it's not likely that your first iteration will not need to be improved after your first test. The test flight is going to be its own set of challenges and is going to give you a different set of problems to solve than the build or the design. In the design, I was thinking about what's it going to look like? How's it going to fly? With the build, I'm thinking, okay, maybe I shouldn't put this together this way, it doesn't make sense, or I didn't think about doing this until now I have to assemble it and it's not easy, so I should make a change to make this more simple. The test flight, if it flies, it's going to probably give you some things to look at, but more importantly, the test flight is going to show you the major flaws in the plane, because this is it. This is the moment of truth. Either it's going to fly or it's not. So let's start with the design. So the design was a little bit more in depth than anything else in terms of planning. I broke the design down into 4 parts. That was create a list of constraints and design choices, make a sketch of the aircraft, create a 3D model of the aircraft, and create a set of build plans from that 3D model. I definitely relied heavily on my plan. It's very hard to me to rifle through my thoughts and choose the ones that maybe are worth taking a second look at and getting rid of the ones that are just noise. One of the ways I helped streamline that process was I first made a list of constraints and design choices. This list was a way for me to organize my thoughts before I started putting that idea down on paper. Constraints are meant to define your design and limit your ideas to only those that meet the constraints. Flite Test gave us the first constraint. It had to be inspired by the Red Bull Air Races. For me, that meant it had to look like it belonged to the Red Bull Air Races, so it would be blue and red and silver or some variation of colors that reminds me of Red Bull, but it would also have to look like it was fast and agile. Imagine if the challenge was to just design any plane you want. For me, having at least somewhat of a direction, like for this one, Red Bull Air Races, makes it a lot easier than if I was given freedom to do anything I wanted. Because if I'm given freedom to do anything I wanted, especially when it comes to something I'm really interested in, I can waste a lot of time trying to think of the next best thing, only to end up with something ordinary or to end up with nothing at all. So after that, you can have other constraints. You don't have to, because one constraint can narrow down the thought process a lot. I went further and I made other constraints. I wanted to have a symmetric airfoil because that's synonymous with aerobatic planes, and I'd never made a symmetric airfoil, so I was kind of excited to learn how to do that. I also said I wanted a high thrust to weight ratio. Anything near 1-to-1 would have been good enough. The last constraint was a note to me. I said keep it simple. Like I said before, I can get carried away, so I'm just telling myself here, you don't need to make something amazing, just make a plane with a general look and go from there. Once you have a list of constraints, you can make a list of other design choices or certain things you want to have on the aircraft. So my design choices were, it was going to have a Red Bull color scheme, red, blue, silver. I wanted easily removable wings because I also wanted to design different types of wings to try out later. I said to consider winglets depending on the performance of the plane. I didn't follow the design choices like I did the constraints. I just did it to make a list and brainstorm, to get my ideas out on paper, and basically that's what it is. So now that I have an idea of what the plane should be capable of, I need to take that idea and make a sketch out of it. I need to put it down on paper. I drew inspiration from some of my favorite World War II planes, the P-51D, the P-40, and the Me-262. I think those planes kind of show themselves a little bit in my design, some more than others. I think the profile, to me, has a little bit more of a look of a, I guess, of a P-40 and an Me-262 kind of mixed together. I drew a profile and a top view. I also drew in where I would want the wings to be, and also, of course, I added the tail section. So once I made the first sketch, then I took a step back, I looked at it, and I saw that maybe I shouldn't have the tail the way it is. The location of the horizontal stabilizer in reference to the vertical stabilizer was something I wanted to make a change to. Because this plane was going to be aerobatic, I was going to make it to where the control surfaces had a high throw. With that in mind, I noticed that the elevators would have been interfering with the sweep of the rudder. So I made a little note and said I'm going to move that forward. So I made a second sketch, I moved the horizontal stabilizer forward, and I took another look at it. The first thing I saw was the hinge line and the size of the rudder. The hinge line I drew angled, probably because I was just in the creative mood and I was trying to make it look cool and streamlined, but you don't want an angled hinge line on your rudder, because what that'll do is when you use it, it will apply a pitching moment to the aircraft. It may not be a big pitching moment, but it's something that is just not necessary. So I made a note to make it vertical, and I also decided I wanted to move the wings forward a little bit. So the third sketch, I made these changes, I looked at it, and I was happy with it. I did something similar with the wings. The wings were a little easier to draw. It's important that you make the drawings have a scale appearance in reference to each other. This is because later you're going to have to dimension the aircraft and you're going to be using your drawings, and I'll get to that in a minute. But one thing I did with the wings, and because I kept them as a scale appearance, is I folded the piece of paper I drew the wings on in a way that I could lay it over top of the fuselage drawing just to see what they would look like. That's also another way to help me decide if this is the wing I want, this is the way I want it to look. I've decided on my fuselage, I've decided on my wing design. I need to make a detailed drawing. And because I know that my model is not going to have the curves that my drawing does, I take a piece of paper, I put it over top of my final drawing, and I trace it, but while I'm tracing it, I'm making straight edges. I'm turning my design from this curved shape into a polygon. It's going to have a lot of sides, as many as you want, it's going to look as boxy as you want, and I basically did it in a way that I thought complemented the actual shape of the aircraft. I did this with the side and the top. So now you have to decide how big it's going to be. What is it going to look like? How large do I want it to be? The easy way to do this is you choose a major dimension of the aircraft. For me, the major dimensions are the wingspan and the length of the fuselage. I chose the length of the fuselage. I looked around the room. I took two pieces of foam board. I laid them next to each other lengthwise, and that looked like a good length for my fuselage. Measured it, it's 40 inches. So now what do I do with this dimension? Well, this dimension is going to define the rest of the airplane, but you also have to apply that to your build plans. How do I know if the length of the fuselage is 40 inches, how do I know the width of the fuselage, or the height of the fuselage, or the distance between the nose and the leading edge of the wings? This is why it's very important for your drawing to have a scale appearance. I measured the length of my fuselage. The length I got was 4 3/8 inches. So with this dimension, I divided it from 40, which is my final, and I got 9.55. That represents the ratio between the scale of the drawing and the aircraft. So the drawing is a 1 to 9.55 scale of the final model. So now I measure the other dimensions on the drawing, and that dimension I get, I multiply it by 9.55, and that gives you your final dimensions. Now that I have this drawing, I decided to make a 3D model because I'd never made build plans. I knew that the build plans represented a 2D version of the plane if it was just unfolded and laid flat. It's hard to visualize what that's going to look like based on a drawing, and unless I wanted to just try and build the plane and use trial and error and then unfold it and make build plans out of that, I had to think of something else. So I was familiar with 3D modeling. I used a program called Fusion 360 and I built a 3D model of my plane. The reason I did this is because I knew that I can make sketches out of all the faces, and those sketches can then be saved and put into a program that can orient them in the form of build plans. I definitely used the dimensions, the final dimensions on my detailed drawing for the 3D model. And when I took all these sketches, they get saved as a .dxf file. Only certain programs can read that. CAD programs, Adobe Illustrator, Inkscape. I used Adobe Illustrator, which does cost money. You have to pay a subscription for Adobe Illustrator, but they have a free trial, and I used the free trial, and I loved it so much I had to just keep using it. Plus, I put a lot of work into it. Inkscape does something similar to Adobe, but it's free. I didn't use it much. I had already been invested in Adobe Illustrator at that point, but that's an option if you want to go the free route. And CAD you definitely have to pay for. It's a little different, but so Adobe Illustrator can take these sketches, I can move them, I can rotate them, I can flip them, and put them any way I want. And that's how I made build plans.